So to give you a little bit of context first, Everwise is a career development company, so we have a platform to help people progress in their careers. And yeah, a big part of it is the web where people interact with their mentors and learning experience and that type of stuff. So we've been around for like 5 years, and our business goal was to improve UX. So management is like, we need to have like a snappier environment, we need to upgrade everything. And from that business goal, the idea came to start, going towards React. So to give you a bit more context, Everwise is around 15 engineers, around 100 more Everwisers in San Francisco and New York. This is our Chief Happiness Officer. He's on our website. His name is Cooper. This was with Halloween, obviously. It's not his daily costume. Our code base, when I talk purely about the front end, the JavaScript, we have around 1,700 files and around 124,000 lines, which also means that this is sort of what we created the last like 6 to 8 months. So it's been quite a journey. So when getting a goal from management to improve our UX, part of that was performance, and part of it is being able to just create like nicer components and animations, transitions. But to justify such a move from Angular to React, we need to get buy-in from the organization. So it all started with 2 engineers who had a vision, like, hey, we can take React and make everything a lot faster and at the same time clear our technical debt and create a lot of tests and add to stability and that type of stuff. One of them is in the crowd. I'm not going to point him out. So the business case is, React is obviously very fast at rendering and everything. I'm not going to dive into that too much, but like I said, for us, stability was another thing because we were lacking tests with Angular. And the third is like, we need to hire, we need to grow. React is sexier, that's why we're all here. So for us, that was a pretty important reason to move to React. So management was like, yeah, but if we're going to invest so much in doing this whole migration from one system to another, how are we going to keep releasing new features in the meantime? How are we going to keep growing our business? So the solution to that is we gradually ported the whole code base, letting Angular and React work together instead of doing the stop the world approach where we would like create the whole project and then switch at the end. And the major benefit is while a couple of people are porting our existing code base to React, the other people can still build features in either Angular or React, and at some point everything in React. And that way you don't have to port the features that you're already building. So with that, we gave some presentations, or not me, but the engineers, and business agreed, so we started. We chose a side-by-side approach, and that's what I'm going to explain to you today. Generally, our architecture looked like this, the architecture that we envision. The upper part is just Angular with just a common Angular structure. The bottom part is a React and Redux architecture. It's hard to call an architecture, but yeah. The green area sort of indicates a regular React Redux setup. So this is what we envision. We let the routes, the components, and the services all work together, gradually port components to React, and at the same time sort of services layer to Redux, and then make everything work together, apply some magic, and then switch the whole thing. So the 3 major technical components to blend the 2 frameworks were to first take care of the routing, because you have URLs and they need to point to both frameworks in some way and just work. So we had to do some stuff there. ngReact is a way to create React components and load them into Angular, which is a pretty easy way to start porting a lot of things. And the third, like I already mentioned, is we wanted to port our Angular services to Redux. So looking back at the same architecture, the green line, I'm going to start with the routing. This is a code snippet. I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but basically this is a part of an Angular router. It's CoffeeScript, where we just have like 2 routes. And as you can see, we include React here while having Angular there. So this way we can have routes that are pure Angular, but just loading React components in it. And I'm about to explain how we actually did that. So this is a piece of code that we created. As you can see with the arrow on the left, what we were doing here is sort of inject a way to route Angular routes within React. Because like a lot of components need to redirect to some other page, right? So like the only way to do it is to use Angular router. But we didn't want to let we didn't want to let React call Angular. So the routing was our only exception. In general, the architecture we applied is Angular is allowed to call React, but React is never allowed to call Angular. So it's the Hollywood principle, like don't call us, we'll call you. So we applied that here, and this is the only exception that React needs to wait to at least route. So this is our only exception to the rule. So we injected some Angular router into React, and here you can see the React component, and especially the higher order component at the bottom. What we did is this is the previous code but implemented. So from a React perspective, you just get a redirect to function that you can use in your component, which will just like proxy to Angular, and then you can redirect to another page. So this is how we sort of hacked both routers together. To actually port the component, so in Angular you have directives and components, which are sort of the same thing. It's obviously like an easy way to port things is to say, okay, we take all these Angular components and just turn it into React. So ngReact is an open source library for that, and it looks a little bit like this. This is a common Angular setup, just an application, but with a React component in the middle. I think it's pretty straightforward. This way you can pass in Angular properties and just load it into React and let them work together very easily. The third part, which is a little bit more complex, is Redux. So we wanted to let Angular work with Redux so that we can start porting our APIs and our like business logic layer by just taking out parts of Angular and put them in Redux actions and selectors. And I just saw everyone knows how Redux works, so I'm not going to explain it. But we're mapping Redux actions and selectors to Angular, which looks a little bit like this. This is a common Redux setup where we combine some reducers with the exception that we include the files, the selectors and the actions, which is here, and then just export them. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to load this into Angular so that we can just inject it in our Angular code and use it. And that way we can call our API and do all our things by just calling this code, which is purely Redux. So here you can see an Angular controller, or actually a factory service, where we have a couple of injected services, which are basically just Redux services calling our API in a whole Redux state. So if we also have React components that talk to Redux, this will trigger Redux and then trigger the React component. So Angular doesn't have to talk to React directly, but can do it by using Redux. There's an actions that you previously saw, map it to specific Angular services. And then at the bottom, we have the selectors where you need to inject state. This is basically the same as like map dispatch to props and map state to props, which you might know from just regular React and Redux, but then injected in Angular instead of React. So those were the components that we needed, but more importantly, we needed an approach to actually accomplish this because we had like 100,000 lines of code. So like, where do you start? And we chose to go through 3 phases. Phase number 1 is the bottom-up approach, which means like if you have the whole tree of components, we first do the bottom ones that don't have a lot of dependencies and interactions with other components. And that way, it's very easy like to just replace the bottom layer. And it's a good way to start because we can replace some components, like put it in production, see if it works, see if our whole concept works in general, and then start building on that and start building like porting larger components afterwards. Second phase is to take entire pages, well, pages with components that are already ported partially, and then just port the whole thing. And then, so the whole route with all the components, all the things linked to it. And that way, like we started doing that after like 2 months or so. And that way we started just replacing URLs of our application entirely to React. So if you would go to our website, like some URLs is like pure React, some is like Angular with React components, and some are like pure Angular. And it worked really well. Like the package is a little bit bigger temporarily, but it's a good way to gradually port it. And the third, at the end, when everything is ported, we needed to switch the routers, like Angular router to React router, clean up authentication and all that stuff, switch it, and done. Throw away Angular and never look at it again. Although I do love Angular, so I don't want to be too rude. The bottom-up approach is the Angular components ported to React, so like the leaf nodes of a tree, basically. We used ngReact for that, obviously, like I told you before. This is our first sprint. This is like our Asana project where we define like stories that people are working on. And you can see in like the green area, those are all like small components like pictures, users, just simple things to port, which was a great way to provide a proof of concept in production. The page-by-page approach touches on the components and the routes, but not the router itself. So we keep the Angular router, but we load just the React component inside of it, nothing else. So the page-by-page approach touches the whole tree and is like a lot larger, and it touches a lot of Angular components that need to be ported. So that was that looked a little bit like this. The thing we did is, let's say you have a notifications page, right? We created a notifications to page, which would be the React version of the same thing. And the nice thing about this is you can just compare side by side if you're like migrating it correctly. Like, is the page still the same as the Angular one? And then also for QA, if people are gonna test it or like automation, you can just like figure out that it works the same, which was quite a nice approach. Another benefit is that we didn't have to like do context switching, like, oh, I need to fix Angular and like I need to build some React. This way it's just pure React, like don't think about Angular at all. And we thought that worked pretty well. Maybe we should have started that earlier. The last step, like I said, is kick out the Angular router, make it a React router, which is pretty obvious. Another big thing is like, how do you approach this from like a people perspective? So like I said before, we have a team of around 15 engineers plus like QA and other people. So the initial team were just a couple of people sort of porting the lower end things, figuring out the setup, the framework, that type of stuff. But one approach we took is to, like new hires, we would just put them on the port, so they only have to focus on React. They don't have to learn our whole Angular code base and all this stuff that we're not going to be using in a couple months. That actually worked pretty well because it created like experts in something. And instead of relying on all this knowledge of like the old framework, we could just immediately focus on the new one. Another big benefit of that is that we could update our onboarding process every time. So we keep like adding new people to the team gradually while we're porting, and at the same time updating the docs and like updating all the things that we think are important. And that was actually very useful, so I would definitely recommend that. And at some point we made the decision, I would say halfway through, like, okay, from now on, no more Angular. So the people who were not porting from Angular to React, but the other people on the team, they had to start writing everything in React, because there's no point in writing in Angular if we need to replace it in React the next month or so. So we had a moment with lunch and learn sessions and a buddy system where every engineer would get a buddy from the port team who would be your personal buddy to help you out with React. And that system is still in place because the whole port has been done. I guess we released it 2 weeks ago, so it's quite new. So I still have my buddy, and Everyone has their body, and we're super happy about that. This was our approach, and we also learned a couple of things. So to first start with our actual goals, like we reached around like 80% better page loads. I don't have the exact number, but like we were able to do code splitting easier, and just the fact that React is much faster gave us a lot of performance benefits. So we're happy we did it. At the same time, we had no proper front-end test coverage, and now we test like a lot, and everyone is super happy because like I see like my colleagues like being happy in the crowd right now, so you can even hear them. It's great. There's also a couple of things we learned. So first, like when you port from one framework to like a totally different framework that's very different, it's not the same concept, and we should have envisioned a little bit more the larger architecture of what we were doing. So instead of porting all the components separately, we should have thought about these components are very similar. Maybe we need to like create some form of architecture. We did that generally, but we should have done it more. So anyone who would try to move from a framework to React, and I would just advise like try to really draw your architecture and think a lot about like the similarities so the React components don't get too verbose. The second one ties into that, like don't adapt to Angular, just do it, try to do it the React way as much as possible instead of like porting Angular functions to Redux and React and that type of thing. In the beginning, we did that a little bit too much, and then later we started refactoring a lot, and that was actually very good for us. And the last but not least, the whole thing about switching Angular router to React router at the end was very difficult, a little bit painful, error prone. We could have bridged both routers. Instead of having one, just let them work together. Previously, I showed you how we sort of hacked Angular router into React, which is this one. This one you might remember. Another version would be to have an Angular component that takes some React router history and let them work together. And you might recognize that, like the history part from React router. That's definitely something we could have done differently, so we don't have to like change the whole thing at the end. That's our journey. That's what we did. Like I said, 2 weeks ago, we launched everything. I touched on the architecture, and everything is live now, so we still have to see how it's going to go, but we're very happy we did that. So that's it for me. Any questions?
Which version of Angular did you switch to, and what was the motivation behind the migration?
So the Angular version was 1.5 dot something, I'm not sure. And React, we're now running React 16, so like the fastest, sweetest, newest stuff.
So if several people working on the porting at the same time, and they both going to using the same component, so who's going to build a component?
I think that's a good question, because like you can touch on the same component. So like we tried to separate all the work as much as possible so you don't have to touch each other's components too much. But I guess like whenever this happened, we just had to communicate and see who merges in first so you don't have to fix the conflicts, you know? Like.
I was seeing examples in components, right? Angular 2 components. So in Angular 1, where you just have using controllers and custom directives, how do you make an Angular 1 custom directive to work with React? Is it possible with ngReact?
We tried to replace the directives with React components, but the way we did it is within a directive you can load a React component, right? Because it's like HTML, and our ngReact library made that work. So also in an Angular directive we could inject our services with the Redux stuff. So generally we tried not to port partial directives, but just do the whole thing. But we had a couple of ways of just doing that. I'm not sure what exactly you're.
Well, the thing is, in Angular 1 we don't actually export as components, right? So we just have custom directives. If we export it as components in the form like we do it in Angular, yeah, I think we can actually import the components into React, React store or something like that.
But they're part of they're part of an Angular module, and we were able to include our services and our ngReact component, which is within Angular, and that made it render within directives or any type of Angular.
In Angular 1.5, there are a lot of the really similar patterns like being adopted that kind of they brought on from Angular or Angular 2 plus or whatever you want to call it. But like components and one-way data flow. What was one of the reasons, or like a couple of the reasons behind like just kind of instead of adopting patterns that React kind of put forward, it's actually you chose to like wholesale rewrite your application? Because you could also make the point of like you can just adopt those patterns in Angular 1 and kind of stay where you were at.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and the answer is our code base was pretty large, and like I said, like not well tested and everything. So whatever we were going to do, it had to be like a bigger project. So since we looked at UX and like page loading times and everything, and people were very excited about React, we chose to go for React. But it's a valid point. We could have done that, but it would have been a pretty big project as well. So we just tried to move to something newer, basically.